The mountain man who called himself Walker Quinn had lived in the wilderness for 6 hard years, and in all that time, he had never once thought about redemption until he saw Clara Lawrence step off the stagecoach in Boise, Idaho, wearing a blue traveling dress that made her look like a piece of heaven dropped into the dust. It was late summer of 1873, and the heat pressed down on the mining town like a heavy hand. Walker had come down from his trap lines in the Sawtooth Mountains to trade pelts and stock up on supplies, a trip he made maybe 3 times a year when loneliness got so sharp it cut deeper than the winter cold. He stood outside the mercantile, his buckskin shirt stretched tight across shoulders built from hauling bear traps and wrestling stubborn mules through mountain passes. His dark hair hung past his collar, tangled from weeks without proper washing, and his beard needed trimming. He knew he looked more animal than man, which suited him fine. Animals did not have to explain themselves or apologize for the things they had done in the war. The stagecoach rattled to a stop in a cloud of dust, and the driver climbed down to help the passengers disembark. First came a portly merchant Walker recognized from previous trips, then a young woman who moved with such careful grace that every man on the street stopped what he was doing to watch. She could not have been more than 22 or 23, with honey-colored hair pinned up beneath a modest bonnet and eyes the color of creek water in spring. She placed her gloved hand in the driver's calloused palm and stepped down onto the wooden sidewalk, pausing to brush the dust from her skirts with movements that suggested she had been raised to care about such things. "That is the new preacher's daughter," said a voice beside Walker. He glanced over to find old Pete Henderson, who ran the livery stable and knew everyone's business. "Reverend Lawrence sent for her from back east. Boston, I heard, going to help him with the church and teach at the new schoolhouse once it gets built." Walker grunted, meaning to turn away and get back to his business, but his eyes would not cooperate. The young woman was looking around Boise with an expression caught somewhere between determination and uncertainty, as if she was trying to convince herself she had made the right choice coming to this rough place. A drunk stumbled out of the saloon across the street and she flinched but kept her chin up. "Too fine for a place like this," Pete continued, following Walker's gaze. "Too holy, if you ask me. Her father is one of those fire and brimstone types. Probably keeps her locked up reading scripture all day. Pretty thing like that wasted on prayer books." Something in Pete's tone made Walker's jaw tighten, though he could not say why he should care. He had given up on things like churches and propriety and decent women years ago. His life was mountains and solitude, and the occasional violent necessity when claim jumpers or hostile animals threatened what little he had carved out for himself. A preacher's daughter from Boston had no place in that world, and he had no place in hers. "I've got pelts to sell," Walker said, his voice rough from disuse. He did not talk much up in the mountains, sometimes going weeks with only his mule for company, and his vocal cords always needed a few days to remember how to work properly when he came to town. But as he turned to head into the mercantile, he saw a group of miners approaching the young woman with the kind of swagger that came from too much time away from civilization, and too much whiskey in their bellies, even at this hour of the morning. The biggest one, a bearded brute named Sykes who had a reputation for meanness, stepped directly into her path. "Well, well," Sykes drawled, loud enough for half the street to hear. "Aren't you a sweet little thing? How about a kiss to welcome you to Boise?" The young woman stepped back, her face going pale. "Excuse me, sir. I am looking for the church." "Oh, a church girl," Sykes laughed, and his companions joined in. "Even better. I always wondered if holy girls kiss different than saloon girls." Walker felt something hot and dangerous unfold in his chest. He had told himself he did not care about other people's problems anymore, that 6 years in the mountains had burned away whatever he used to be before the war made him into something hard and cold. But watching this delicate woman face down 3 rough men who outweighed her by 100 pounds each, seeing the fear she was trying so hard to hide, he discovered there was still something human left inside him after all. "She said, 'Excuse me,'" Walker said, his voice carrying across the street with the kind of authority that came from ordering men into battle, from making split-second decisions about who lived and who died. "I suggest you step aside." Sykes turned, his expression shifting from amusement to irritation. "This isn't your concern, mountain man. Go back to your hole." Walker closed the distance between them with long strides, his hands loose at his sides but ready. Up close, he had 3 inches and probably 40 pounds of muscle on Sykes, all of it earned through hard labor and harder living. "I am making it my concern. The lady wants to go to the church. You are going to let her pass." For a moment, the street went quiet. Sykes was known for being quick with his fists and quicker with his knife, but he was also smart enough to recognize when he was outmatched. Walker had the kind of calm that came from not caring much whether he lived or died, which made him more dangerous than any amount of bluster or bravado. "We were just having some fun," Sykes muttered, but he stepped aside, and his companions followed suit. Walker did not watch them go. He turned to the young woman, who was staring at him with those creek water eyes wide with something that might have been gratitude or might have been fear. He supposed he did look fearsome, all wild hair and weathered skin and muscles built from survival. "Thank you," she said softly. Her voice had a musical quality, educated and careful. "Thank you very much." Walker touched the brim of his hat, a gesture he had not made in so long it felt strange. "The church is 2 streets over, next to the schoolhouse. I would walk you there, but—" He gestured at himself, at the buckskins and the knife on his belt and the general appearance of someone who had not seen the inside of a church in half a decade. To his surprise, she smiled. It transformed her whole face, making her beautiful instead of just pretty. "I would appreciate the escort, Mr. Quinn, Walker Quinn." He did not offer his hand because his hands were stained with blood and dirt, and all the things a woman like her should never have to touch. "Clara Lawrence," she replied, and before he could protest, she had linked her arm through his as if they were strolling through a Boston park instead of a muddy street in mining territory. "It is very kind of you to help me, Mr. Quinn." The feel of her hand on his arm, even through the layers of fabric and buckskin, sent something electric through Walker's body. He could not remember the last time he had touched another person except in violence. The simple warmth of it, the trust implied in the gesture, made his throat tight. They walked in silence for a few moments, Clara stepping carefully around the worst of the mud while Walker shortened his usual ground-eating stride to match her pace. People stared as they passed, and Walker knew what they were thinking. A creature from the wild escorting an angel. It was unnatural, impossible, like a wolf walking beside a lamb. "Have you lived in Boise long, Mr. Quinn?" Clara asked, apparently oblivious to or unconcerned by the stares. "I live up in the mountains," Walker replied. "I only come to town for supplies." "Oh, are you a miner, trapper?" "I hunt and trap, sell the pelts, head back up before." He trailed off, unsure how to explain that he went back up before the presence of too many people made him feel like his skin was too tight, before the memories got too loud. "It must be beautiful up there," Clara said, a wistful note in her voice. "I have read about the mountains, but I have never seen real ones before. Massachusetts has hills, but nothing like what I saw from the stagecoach." Walker found himself looking at her in surprise. Most people saw the mountains as obstacles or resources, things to cross or exploit. They are beautiful, he admitted. Harsh but beautiful, not really a place for. Again he stopped himself, but this time she finished the thought for him. For a proper Boston lady. There was amusement in her voice rather than offense. Perhaps not. But I did not come here to stay proper, Mr. Quinn. I came here to help my father build something good, to teach children who might not otherwise get an education, to be useful rather than ornamental. They had reached the church, a simple wooden structure with a cross mounted above the door. It was new enough that Walker could still smell the pine sap, probably built within the last year as Boise grew from a mining camp into something that thought of itself as a town. A man in a dark suit was sweeping the front steps, and he looked up at their approach. Clara. The man dropped his broom and hurried down to meet them, and Walker saw the family resemblance in the shape of the eyes and the determined set of the jaw. Reverend Lawrence was perhaps 50, with graying hair and the kind of lean frame that came from putting everyone else's needs before his own. Thank the Lord, I was beginning to worry. The stagecoach was late, and He trailed off as he finally seemed to notice Walker standing there, his daughter's hand still resting on the mountain man's arm. "Father, this is Mr. Walker Quinn," Clara said smoothly, stepping back but not before giving Walker's arm a gentle squeeze that he felt all the way to his bones. "He very kindly escorted me from the coach after some ruffians attempted to accost me." Reverend Lawrence's expression shifted from confusion to concern to gratitude in rapid succession. "Mr. Quinn, I cannot thank you enough. The streets here can be dangerous for a woman alone. I should have met the coach myself, but there was an emergency with the widow Peterson and I." He stuck out his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Walker shook it. "Please, is there some way I can repay your kindness?" "No need," Walker said gruffly. "Just happened to be there." "Nevertheless, you have my deepest gratitude." The Reverend's grip was surprisingly strong for a man who worked with words instead of axes. "Will you be staying in town long? You would be welcome at our service on Sunday." Walker almost laughed at the image of himself sitting in a pew, his weapons and wildness contained by 4 walls and a ceiling. "I will be heading back up the mountain tomorrow, most likely." "Then I hope you will accept an invitation to supper tonight," Reverend Lawrence insisted. "It is the least we can offer after your assistance. Clara has been promising me her mother's recipe for chicken and dumplings, and we have far too much food for just the 2 of us." Every instinct told Walker to refuse, to get his supplies and get out of town, before he started remembering what it felt like to be around decent people and wanting things he could not have. But Clara was looking at him with those creek water eyes, and he found himself nodding before his better judgment could stop him. 6 o'clock, the Reverend said, beaming. "The parsonage is just behind the church. We will see you then, Mr. Quinn." Walker touched his hat brim again and turned to leave, but he could feel Clara's gaze on him as he walked away, warm as summer sun on his back. The rest of the day passed in a haze of activity that could not quite distract him from thinking about supper. Walker sold his pelts to the mercantile owner, haggling with less intensity than usual and accepting a price that was probably lower than he should have. He bought flour, coffee, salt, ammunition, and the other necessities that would keep him alive through another mountain winter. He got his mule Rashad at the livery, enduring Pete Henderson's knowing looks and pointed questions about the preacher's daughter. "I just walked her to the church," Walker said, checking the mule's lead rope with more attention than it required. "Sure you did," Pete agreed in a tone that suggested he did not believe it for a second. "And now you are having supper with her, just being neighborly, I suppose." "The Reverend invited me." "The Reverend invites lots of people. Most of them do not look like they have been hit by lightning when they accept." Pete spat tobacco juice into the straw. Listen, Quinn, I do not mean to pry, but that girl is not for the likes of you and me. She is educated, refined, religious. Her father probably has plans for her to marry some missionary or another preacher. A man who lives in the mountains and comes to town smelling like bear grease is not going to fit into that picture. Walker knew Pete was right. He had known it the moment he saw Clara step off that stagecoach. But knowing something and accepting it were different animals entirely. "It is just supper," he said, leading his mule out of the stable and back toward the boarding house where he always rented a room on his rare visits to civilization. The boarding house keeper, a widow named Mrs. Chen, who had come from California during the gold rush, took one look at him and pointed toward the bathhouse out back. "You cannot eat with a preacher smelling like that. There is hot water and soap. Use them." Walker wanted to argue, but he caught a whiff of himself and had to concede the point. He spent the next hour scrubbing away weeks of mountain living, washing his hair until it no longer felt like animal fur, shaving his beard down to something more respectable. He did not have any clothes other than buckskins, but Mrs. Chen apparently anticipated this problem because she showed up at the bathhouse door with a white shirt and dark trousers that had belonged to her late husband. "He was about your size," she said, thrusting the clothes at him. "Try not to ruin them." When Walker looked at himself in the cracked mirror above the wash basin, he barely recognized the man staring back. Clean-shaven except for a neatly trimmed mustache, hair still damp but combed, wearing clothes that made him look almost civilized. He could see traces of the person he used to be before the war, before the mountains. It was not entirely a comfortable feeling. He arrived at the parsonage at precisely 6 o'clock, carrying a bottle of decent whiskey he had purchased from the mercantile, because showing up empty-handed seemed wrong even if he had forgotten most of the rules of polite society. The parsonage was small but tidy, with curtains in the windows and a garden out front that was trying hard to grow in the Idaho soil. Reverend Lawrence answered his knock with a welcoming smile that made Walker feel like even more of an imposter. "Mr. Quinn, please come in. And you can call me Thomas if you would like. We are not formal here." The inside of the parsonage smelled like home cooking and beeswax polish. It was simply furnished but clean, with a few books on a shelf and a cross on the wall. Clara appeared from what must have been the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron, and when she saw him her eyes went wide. "Mr. Quinn, I almost did not recognize you." She seemed flustered in a way she had not been earlier, color rising in her cheeks. "Please sit down. Supper will be ready in just a few minutes." Walker sat carefully in one of the chairs at the dining table, feeling like a bear trying to use doll furniture. The chair creaked under his weight but held. Reverend Lawrence poured 3 glasses of water from a pitcher and took a seat across from him. "So, Mr. Quinn, how long have you been trapping in these mountains?" the Reverend asked with genuine interest. "About 6 years," Walker replied. "Came out after the war ended, needed somewhere. Quiet, he wanted to say, somewhere the screaming stopped, somewhere different." Thomas nodded with understanding that suggested he had heard similar stories before. Many men found their way west for similar reasons. The war left scars on all of us, whether we fought or not. He took a sip of his water. "Do you ever get lonely up there?" The question caught Walker off guard. Most people asked about danger or cold or how he survived the winters, practical things. No one asked about loneliness. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but lonely is better than." He could not finish the sentence with Clara moving between the kitchen and the table, setting down plates and bowls, her presence making the room feel both larger and smaller at the same time. "Better than crowds," Clara offered gently, surprising him with her perception. "I felt that way in Boston, actually." Surrounded by people but feeling utterly alone because no one truly saw me. They just saw what they expected me to be. She sat down beside her father, removing her apron to reveal a simple gray dress that somehow made her look even prettier than the blue traveling outfit. Walker tried not to stare and failed completely. They bowed their heads for grace, and Walker bowed his too out-of-rusty habit, listening to Thomas's warm voice thanking God for food and safety and new friends. When the prayer ended, they began passing dishes, and Walker discovered that Clara's chicken and dumplings were possibly the best thing he had ever tasted. He said as much, and her smile made the parsonage seem brighter. "My mother taught me," Clara said. "She passed when I was 16, but she made sure I knew how to run a household first. She would be pleased to know her recipe is appreciated even in Idaho territory." "I am sure she would be proud of you for many reasons," Walker said, the words coming easier than he expected. Maybe it was the good food, or the comfortable room, or the way Clara looked at him like he was a person rather than a curiosity or a threat. The conversation flowed more naturally after that. Thomas talked about his hopes for the church and the school, about wanting to bring education and faith to a place that desperately needed both. Clara spoke about her plans to teach reading and writing, about books she had loved and wanted to share with children who might never otherwise have access to them. Walker found himself talking more than he had in years, telling stories about the mountains, about the wildlife and the changing seasons and the strange beauty of being completely alone under a sky full of stars. "It sounds wonderful," Clara said with such longing that Walker looked at her in surprise. "It is hard," he warned. "Dangerous, cold in winter, hot in summer, always working just to survive." "But honest," she replied. "Everything you do matters. There is no pretense, no social games, no worrying about what people think, just you and nature and—" She trailed off, looking almost embarrassed. "I am sorry. I must sound foolish, romanticizing something I know nothing about." "You do not sound foolish," Walker said, and meant it. "You sound like you understand better than most." Their eyes met across the table, and something passed between them that made Walker's heart beat faster. He saw himself teaching her to read animal tracks, showing her where the wild strawberries grew in summer, watching her face when she saw the first snow on the peaks. Impossible images, foolish images, but they burned in his mind with painful clarity. Thomas cleared his throat gently, breaking the moment. "More coffee, Mr. Quinn." They moved to the sitting area after the meal, and Thomas asked Walker about practical matters like where to buy good horses and which trails were safest for traveling between Boise and the smaller settlements that were springing up in the territory. Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap, listening more than talking now, but every time Walker glanced at her, he found her watching him with an expression he could not quite read. When the evening finally ended and Walker made his way back to the boarding house, his head was spinning with confusion and something dangerously close to hope. He had come to town for supplies. He had planned to leave tomorrow, get back to his mountain solitude where life made sense, and nobody expected anything from him except survival. But now there was a woman with creek water eyes who looked at the mountains the way he did, who talked about honesty and purpose, who made chicken and dumplings that tasted like home. "Too holy," he muttered to himself, remembering what Pete had said. "She is the preacher's daughter. Too holy for someone like me." But even as he said it, he remembered the way she had taken his arm without hesitation, the way she had blushed when she saw him cleaned up, the way she had spoken about escaping pretense and finding something real. Maybe she was holy, but maybe that was exactly what his rough life needed. Maybe she could make it better. Walker lay awake in his rented bed for a long time that night, listening to the sounds of Boise settling down for sleep, thinking about a woman he had met only that morning but who had somehow gotten under his skin like a splinter that could not be pulled out. He told himself he was being a fool. He told himself to stick to the plan, leave tomorrow, forget about creek water eyes and impossible dreams. But when morning came, he did not pack up his mule and head for the mountains. Instead, he found himself walking toward the church, where he could hear someone playing a piano, the notes drifting out into the summer air like an invitation he could not refuse. The church doors were open to let in what little breeze the morning offered, and Walker stood in the doorway watching Clara at the piano. She was alone, her fingers moving over the keys with practiced ease, playing something beautiful and complicated that he did not recognize. She had not noticed him yet, too absorbed in the music, and he took the opportunity to really look at her in the morning light streaming through the windows. She wore a simple cotton dress in pale yellow, her hair pinned up, but with a few loose strands curling around her face. There was something unguarded about her expression as she played, a softness and joy that made her seem almost otherworldly. Walker felt something crack open in his chest, some wall he had built to protect himself from feeling too much. The song ended, and in the silence that followed, Clara finally sensed his presence. She turned on the piano bench, her eyes widening in surprise. "Mr. Quinn, I did not expect to see you this morning. I thought you would be heading back to the mountains." "I thought so too," Walker admitted, stepping inside the church and removing his hat. "But it seems I was wrong." She stood, smoothing her skirts, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I am glad you were wrong. Would you like to sit?" "I have a few minutes before I need to start preparing for tomorrow's service." They sat in one of the pews, the wooden bench hard beneath them, sunlight painting patterns on the floor through the windows. Walker felt out of place in this holy space, all his sins and violence and rough living suddenly very present in his mind. But Clara seemed completely comfortable having him there, as if mountain men in churches were the most natural thing in the world. "That was beautiful," Walker said, gesturing toward the piano. "What you were playing. Chopin, one of my mother's favorites. I have not had a piano to play since I left Boston, so having this one in the church is a blessing." She folded her hands in her lap, that same careful gesture he had noticed last night. "May I ask you something, Mr. Quinn?" "Walker," he said. "You can call me Walker," she smiled. "Walker, then, and you should call me Clara. We are friends now, I think, after last night." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "Why do you live alone in the mountains? Not just the general reason, but the real one." No one had ever asked him that question so directly. Walker looked down at his hands, scarred and calloused, capable of violence and survival in equal measure. "Because I did things in the war that I cannot take back. Because I lost men who trusted me to keep them alive. Because when I close my eyes sometimes, I still see their faces, and in the mountains, there is nobody around to hear me when the nightmares come." He expected her to pull away, to be frightened or disgusted by the admission. Instead, she reached over and placed her hand on top of his, the gesture so simple and unexpected that it nearly undid him. "I think you are punishing yourself for surviving when others did not," Clara said softly. "My father sees it in men all the time. They come to him seeking forgiveness for things that were not their fault, tormented by choices made in impossible circumstances. But Walker, isolation is not penance. It is just another kind of death." Her hand was warm on his, small and soft compared to his rough skin, but the touch did not feel fragile. It felt like strength, like an anchor holding him steady when he wanted to pull away. "What would you have me do instead?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion he did not know how to name. I do not know how to be around people anymore. I do not fit in places like this. You are around people right now, she pointed out. You are talking to me, being honest, fitting in just fine. She squeezed his hand gently. Maybe you have been alone so long you have forgotten that you can be anything else. Walker looked at her, really looked at her, and saw none of the pity or judgment he expected. Instead, he saw understanding and something else, something that looked almost like hope. Why do you care? He asked. You do not know me. I could be anyone, anything. But you are not just anyone, Clara replied. You are a man who stopped to help a stranger when no one else would. A man who talked about the mountains like they were a cathedral. A man who has been hurt and is trying to survive the only way he knows how. She withdrew her hand, leaving his feeling cold without her touch. And perhaps selfishly, I care because I see something of myself in you. I am here in this frontier town trying to find purpose and meaning, and you are in those mountains doing the same thing. We are not so different, you and I. You are a preacher's daughter, Walker said. Too holy for someone like me. Clara laughed, the sound bright and unexpected in the quiet church. Is that what people say? That I am too holy? She shook her head, still smiling. Walker, I am not a saint. I'm just a woman who has faith and wants to do some good in the world. And for what it is worth, I think you could do more good down here than hiding up in those mountains. You have strength and knowledge that people in this town could use. And maybe, she added more quietly, maybe being around people again could help you heal in ways that solitude never will. Before Walker could respond, Reverend Thomas entered the church through the back door, carrying an armful of hymnals. He stopped when he saw them sitting together, and Walker quickly stood up, feeling like he had been caught doing something improper even though they had only been talking. Good morning, Mr. Quinn, Thomas said warmly, setting down the books. I did not expect to see you still in town. I was just leaving, Walker said automatically, then caught Clara's look of disappointment. Actually, I was wondering if there might be any work available around town for the next week or two. I could use some extra money before winter comes. The lie came easily, but it was not entirely a lie. He could always use extra money, and staying in Boise for a while would give him time to figure out what he was feeling, what he might be willing to risk for the possibility of something more than solitude. Thomas's face lit up. As a matter of fact, we need someone to help repair the schoolhouse roof before it can be used for classes. The carpenter who started the job broke his leg and had to go to Salt Lake City for proper medical treatment. Do you know anything about roofing? Enough to patch my cabin every spring, Walker replied. I reckon I can handle a schoolhouse. Wonderful. The materials are already there and the church can pay you a fair wage. Thomas clapped him on the shoulder with genuine pleasure. Clara will be teaching there, so she can show you what needs to be done. This is a real blessing, Mr. Quinn. Thank you. Walker glanced at Clara and found her watching him with a smile that made his stomach flip. Happy to help, he managed, wondering what exactly he had just gotten himself into. Over the next 2 weeks, Walker discovered that staying in Boise was both easier and harder than he had imagined. The work on the schoolhouse roof was straightforward, replacing rotten boards and shingles damaged by winter storms, and he fell into the rhythm of it with relief. Physical labor he understood, even if it was not hauling traps through mountain passes. What he did not understand was the effect Clara Lawrence had on him. She came to the schoolhouse every day, ostensibly to clean and organize the interior while he worked on the roof, but they always ended up talking during breaks. She would bring him water or coffee, and they would sit in the shade of the building discussing everything from books she loved to his opinions on the best way to smoke venison. She asked him questions about his life that no one else had bothered to ask, and she listened to his answers with genuine interest that made him want to tell her things he had never told anyone. He learned that her mother had died of consumption, that Clara had spent 2 years caring for her while the illness slowly stole her away. He learned that she had been engaged once to a banker's son in Boston, but she had broken it off when she realized he wanted a decorative wife to host parties, not a partner with her own dreams and ambitions. He learned that she had always felt called to teaching, to helping children discover the world through books and learning, and that coming west had been her choice, not just her father's. In turn, he told her about growing up on a farm in Missouri, about how the war had torn through his family and left him the only surviving son. He told her about his years as a cavalry scout, about the things he had seen and done that still woke him up at night. He told her about finding the mountains and building a cabin with his own hands, about the first winter when he had nearly frozen to death, but had been too stubborn to give up. "You are a survivor," Clara said one afternoon as they sat on the schoolhouse steps, watching thunderheads build over the mountains in the distance. "That takes tremendous strength, or tremendous stubbornness," Walker replied. "There is a difference, not as much as you think." She tilted her face toward the sky, closing her eyes against the warm breeze. "Do you ever think about doing something other than trapping? About maybe settling somewhere, building something permanent?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications Walker was not sure he was ready to examine. "I have thought about it," he admitted, "but I do not know what that would look like. I am not a farmer anymore, and I do not have the temperament for shopkeeping or any kind of business." "You could be a guide," Clara suggested, opening her eyes and looking at him with that intensity that always made him feel like she could see right through him. "People are starting to come west for reasons other than mining or settling. They want to see the wilderness, experience the mountains. Someone like you could show them safely, teach them how to appreciate what is out there without destroying it." Walker turned the idea over in his mind, surprised by how appealing it sounded when she described it that way. That would still mean coming back to town regularly, dealing with people. "Would that be so terrible?" Clara asked softly. "Dealing with people." He looked at her, at the way the approaching storm light made her eyes seem even more translucent, at the loose strand of hair the wind had pulled from her careful pins. "No," he said honestly. "I am starting to think it might not be terrible at all." Something shifted in the air between them, a charge like the electricity building with the thunderstorm. Clara's lips parted as if she wanted to say something, and Walker found himself leaning closer, drawn by a force he could not resist and did not want to. But before anything could happen, a crack of thunder made them both jump, and rain began falling in fat drops that quickly turned into a deluge. They ran for the schoolhouse door, laughing and soaked by the time they got inside. Walker shook water from his hair like a dog, and Clara tried to wring out her skirts with limited success. The interior of the schoolhouse was dim with storm light, smelling of fresh wood and chalk dust and rain. "Well," Clara said breathlessly, pushing wet hair back from her face, "I suppose that is the end of work for today." Walker was very aware that they were alone, that her dress was plastered to her figure in a way that made his mouth go dry, that they were standing close enough that he could see the water droplets on her eyelashes. "Clara," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended, "I should not be here with you like this. It is not proper." "Do you want to leave?" she asked, meeting his eyes directly. "No," he admitted, "but what I want and what is right are not always the same thing." Clara stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her despite their wet clothes. "What if they are the same thing? What if what you want is exactly what you need, and exactly what I need too?" "You do not know what you are saying," Walker protested, even as every part of him screamed to close the remaining distance between them. "Your father is a preacher. You are supposed to marry someone respectable, someone who fits into your world." "I am just a mountain man who does not know how to be around people." "You are around me just fine," Clara pointed out. She reached up and touched his face, her palm cool against his bearded cheek. "And I do not want someone respectable if respectable means boring and safe and predictable. I want someone real, someone honest, someone who makes me feel alive when I am near him. I want you, Walker Quinn." The last threads of his restraint snapped. Walker pulled her against him and kissed her with all the longing and loneliness and desperate hope that had been building in him since the moment he first saw her step off that stagecoach. She made a small sound of surprise and then melted into him, her arms wrapping around his neck, kissing him back with an intensity that matched his own. It was not a gentle kiss, or a proper kiss, or any kind of kiss that should happen between a preacher's daughter and a man who lived in the wilderness. It was fierce and hungry and full of need, months and years of isolation pouring out of Walker and into this connection with another human being, with this woman who seemed to understand him in ways he did not understand himself. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Walker rested his forehead against Clara's and tried to remember all the reasons this was a bad idea. But with her in his arms, her heart beating against his chest, he could not think of a single one that mattered more than this moment. "Your father is going to kill me," he said finally. Clara laughed, breathless and joyful. "My father wants me to be happy, and I have not been this happy in years, maybe ever." "I do not have anything to offer you," Walker protested, even as his arms tightened around her waist, unwilling to let her go. "I live in a cabin in the mountains. I own a mule and some traps and not much else. I wake up screaming from nightmares. I am not easy to be with." "I do not need easy," Clara said firmly. "I need honest and real and someone who sees me as more than just a pretty ornament or a preacher's daughter. You see me, Walker, and I see you. Is that not worth more than money or comfort or what other people think?" She was right, and he knew it, but fear still gripped him. What if I fail you? What if I am not enough? What if the nightmares get worse, or I cannot adjust to being around people, or I ruin your life by being selfish enough to think I could make you happy? Clara pulled back enough to look him in the eyes, her hands framing his face. "Walker Quinn, listen to me. I am not some fragile flower that will wilt at the first sign of difficulty. I nursed my mother through consumption. I broke an engagement and disappointed my entire social circle in Boston because I refused to settle for less than I deserved. I came to Idaho Territory knowing it would be hard and rough and nothing like the life I was raised for. I am stronger than you think, and I am choosing this. I am choosing you." The rain pounded on the roof Walker had repaired, the storm raging outside while inside this small schoolhouse. Everything in his life was changing. He kissed her again, softer this time, trying to pour everything he felt into the gesture because words had never been his strength. Clara responded with equal tenderness, her fingers threading through his damp hair, and Walker thought maybe, just maybe, he could learn to believe he deserved this. When the storm finally passed, and they made their way back into town separately to avoid scandalizing the whole community, Walker knew he had to talk to Reverend Thomas. The thought terrified him more than facing down a grizzly bear, but if he was going to do this, he was going to do it right. He found Thomas at the church that evening, going over his sermon notes by lamplight. The Reverend looked up when Walker knocked on the open door, his expression welcoming but curious. "Mr. Quinn, what brings you by so late?" Walker stepped inside, turning his hat in his hands. "I need to talk to you about Clara." Thomas's expression shifted to something more guarded, more protective. He set down his pen and gave Walker his full attention. "I see. Please sit down." They sat facing each other across Thomas's desk, and Walker tried to organize his thoughts into something coherent. "I have developed feelings for your daughter," he said finally. Deciding direct was better than trying to dance around it. "Strong feelings. And I believe she feels the same way about me." "I see," Thomas said again, his face unreadable. "And what exactly are your intentions, Mr. Quinn?" "I want to court her properly," Walker replied. "I want the chance to see if this could be something real and lasting. I know I am not what you probably hoped for her. I do not have education or money or refinement. But I can promise you that I will never lie to her, never hurt her intentionally, and I will spend every day trying to be worthy of her." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, studying Walker with the same penetrating gaze his daughter had. "Clara is the most precious thing in my life," he said finally. "After her mother died, she became my anchor, my purpose for continuing when grief threatened to overwhelm me. I want her to be happy, to have a full life, to be with someone who appreciates the remarkable woman she is." "I do appreciate her," Walker said quietly. "She is unlike anyone I have ever met. She makes me want to be better than I am, to believe I could be something more than just a man hiding in the mountains." "She told me something similar last night," Thomas admitted. "She said you make her feel alive in ways she never has before, that you see her as a whole person instead of just a role to be filled. She is not wrong about that. I have watched you these past 2 weeks, Mr. Quinn. I have seen how you look at her, how you listen when she talks, how you treat her with respect and care. I have also seen how she lights up when you are around, how happy she has been." Walker's heart was pounding so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. "So you are saying—" "I am saying that if Clara wants you to court her, I will not stand in the way. But I want your word that you will treat her honorably, that if this does not work out you will not break her heart carelessly." Thomas leaned forward, and there was steel beneath his gentle demeanor. "She has already been hurt by one man who did not value her properly. I will not allow it to happen again." "You have my word," Walker said solemnly. "On everything I hold sacred, I will treat her right." Thomas stood and extended his hand, and when Walker shook it, he felt the weight of the trust being placed in him. "Then you have my blessing to court my daughter, though I suspect she would have courted you with or without it." Walker could not help but smile at that. "She is stubborn." "She gets it from her mother," Thomas said with his own smile, tinged with old grief and fond memory. "Now, I suggest you make your intentions clear to Clara herself. I believe she is at the boarding house visiting Mrs. Chen, helping her with some sewing." Walker found Clara exactly where her father said she would be, sitting with Mrs. Chen in the boarding house parlor, working on what looked like curtains for the schoolhouse. Clara looked up when he entered, her needle stilling, hope and uncertainty warring in her expression. "Mrs. Chen," Walker said, "would you mind if I borrowed Clara for a few minutes? I would like to speak with her outside." Mrs. Chen looked between them with knowing eyes and waved them away. "Go, go. These curtains can wait." They walked out into the evening air, still fresh and clean smelling from the earlier rain. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that made Clara's face glow as she looked up at Walker expectantly. "I talked to your father," Walker said without preamble. "I asked his permission to court you properly." Clara's whole face lit up. "And," he said, "yes. If you want me to, that is, if you are sure about this." Instead of answering with words, Clara threw her arms around his neck and kissed him right there on the main street of Boise where anyone could see. Walker heard a wolf whistle from somewhere nearby, and Mrs. Chen's delighted laugh from the boarding house window. but he did not care. He wrapped his arms around Clara and kissed her back, feeling like something broken inside him was finally starting to heal. When they separated, both grinning like fools, Clara said, "I am very sure. More sure than I have ever been about anything. Even though it means your life might not look like you planned. Even though I come with nightmares and rough edges and a stubborn attachment to those mountains. Especially because of all that," Clara said firmly. "I did not come west to live a planned life, Walker. I came to find something real. And you are the realest thing I have ever encountered." They walked through town together as the stars began to emerge, talking about what courting might look like, what kind of future they could build together. Walker told her about his cabin, trying to be honest about how rustic it was, and Clara surprised him by wanting to see it. They talked about the possibility of him becoming a guide like she had suggested, maybe building a larger place that could house clients who wanted to experience the mountains safely. "We could do it together," Clara said, her eyes bright with possibilities. "I could teach in town during the school year, and in the summers we could take people into the wilderness. I could write about it, maybe even publish accounts of the journeys. People back east are fascinated by the frontier." Walker listened to her spin these dreams and found himself believing in them, in a future that involved more than just survival. "You would really want to spend your summers in the mountains. It is not comfortable or easy." "I think I would love it," Clara said simply, "as long as I am with you." The courtship that followed was unconventional by any standard. Walker extended his stay in Boise week after week, finding odd jobs around town that kept him busy and earning money. He repaired fences, helped build a new barn for a rancher outside town, worked as a blacksmith's assistant. Clara taught reading lessons to children in the makeshift schoolhouse and helped her father with church duties, but she spent every spare moment with Walker. They walked together through the sagebrush hills surrounding Boise, and Walker taught her to identify animal tracks and edible plants. They sat by the river and talked for hours about everything and nothing. They attended Sunday services together, and Walker slowly grew accustomed to being part of a community again, to people nodding greetings when he passed on the street. The nightmares still came sometimes, and the first time Clara witnessed one, Walker woke to find her sitting beside his bed at the boarding house, having been fetched by Mrs. Chen when his screaming woke the other guests. He was mortified, covered in sweat and shaking, but Clara just handed him water and sat with him until his breathing calmed. "You do not have to go through this alone anymore," she said quietly. "Whatever demons you are fighting, we can fight them together." As summer turned to autumn, Walker realized he was happy in a way he had not been since before the war. Clara brought light and purpose and joy into his life, and he tried to give her the same. He was still rough around the edges, still more comfortable with silence than conversation, but she seemed to love him exactly as he was. One evening in late September, as they sat on the steps of the church watching the sunset, Walker turned to Clara and said, "I want to show you my cabin. I want you to see where I live, to understand that part of my life. And then I want to ask you something important." Clara's eyes widened. "When do we leave?" "Tomorrow, if you are willing. It is a 2-day ride into the mountains. We would need to bring your father as a chaperone, of course, to keep everything proper." "Of course," Clara agreed, but her smile suggested she was thinking the same thing he was, that having her father along would be both necessary and slightly inconvenient given how much they wanted to be alone together. Thomas agreed to the journey with good humor, and the next morning they set out on horseback with supplies and camping gear strapped to Walker's mule. Clara had never been on such a long ride, but she adapted quickly, listening to Walker's instructions about how to sit the horse for rough terrain and when to let the animal pick its own path. The first night they camped in a meadow halfway up into the high country, and Walker watched Clara's wonder as she saw the stars with no town lights to dim them, millions of bright points against the velvet darkness. Thomas built the fire while Walker set up 2 tents, one for Clara and one for the men, everything carefully proper even in the wilderness. They reached the cabin late the following afternoon, and Walker felt nervous as Clara dismounted and looked around at the place he had called home for 6 years. The cabin was small and rough, built from logs he had cut and chinked himself. There was a corral for the mule and a small shed for supplies, a stream running nearby that provided fresh water. The mountains rose up on all sides, massive and beautiful and indifferent to human concerns. "It is perfect," Clara breathed, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "Walker, it is absolutely perfect." "It is small," he said, suddenly seeing it through her eyes and finding it wanting. "And dark, and there is no proper floor, just packed dirt. The roof leaks sometimes, and in winter the wind comes right through the cracks in the walls no matter how much I try to seal them." Clara walked to him and took both his hands in hers. "It is perfect because you built it with your own hands, because you survived here when you needed to survive. Because it is honest and real and exactly what it needs to be." She looked up at the mountains, at the aspens turning gold with autumn, at the clear sky overhead. "I can see why you love it here." Thomas explored the area while Walker showed Clara the inside of the cabin, pointing out the improvements he could make if he had reason to, the ways he could expand it, make it more comfortable. She listened and offered suggestions, and Walker realized they were planning a future together without even saying it explicitly. That evening, after a supper of trout Walker caught from the stream and biscuits Clara made in a Dutch oven over the fire, Thomas announced he was tired and retired to one of the tents. Clara and Walker sat by the fire alone, the flames dancing between them, the night alive with the sounds of the wilderness. "I need to ask you something," Walker said, his heart pounding. He had thought about this for weeks, had agonized over whether it was too soon, whether he was being foolish, whether she would say yes. But sitting here in the place that had been his refuge, with the woman who had become his salvation, the moment felt right. He stood and pulled her to her feet, taking both her hands in his. "Clara Lawrence, I know we have only known each other a few months. I know I am not easy to be with, that I have more problems than solutions, that I can offer you a life that will be hard and uncertain and nothing like what you were raised for. But I love you more than I thought I could love anyone. You have given me hope and purpose and a reason to be better than I was. Will you marry me? Will you take a chance on this rough life and let me spend every day trying to make it better for you?" Clara's eyes filled with tears that caught the firelight like diamonds. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, Walker, I will marry you. I love you exactly as you are, and I want to build this life with you, whatever it looks like." Walker pulled a ring from his pocket, a simple silver band he had bought from the jeweler in Boise and carried with him for the past week waiting for the right moment. It was not fancy or expensive, but when he slipped it onto Clara's finger, it fit perfectly, as if it had been made just for her. They were married 6 weeks later in the church in Boise, with half the town in attendance despite Walker's initial hope for a small ceremony. He wore a proper suit borrowed from the mercantile owner, feeling constrained and uncomfortable but willing to endure it for Clara's sake. She wore a simple white dress she had sewn herself, with wildflowers from the mountains in her hair instead of a fancy veil. Thomas performed the ceremony with tears in his eyes, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, Walker kissed Clara with all the love and gratitude and joy he felt, not caring that people were watching. This woman had saved him in ways she might never fully understand, had taken his rough life, and made it immeasurably better just by being part of it. They spent their wedding night at the boarding house before heading up to the cabin for the winter, and Walker was gentle and patient as he helped Clara through her nervousness, making sure her first time was filled with love and care rather than just passion. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Clara traced the scars on his chest and arms and told him stories about her mother, about growing up in Boston, about all the things she was grateful to leave behind, and all the things she was excited to discover. "I am going to make mistakes," Walker warned her. "I am going to be difficult sometimes. The nightmares might get worse before they get better. There will be days when I am not good company. And there will be days when I am stubborn and demanding and insist on doing things my way even when you know better," Clara replied. "We are both human, Walker. We are both going to fail each other sometimes. But as long as we keep choosing each other, as long as we keep trying, we will be all right." She was right, as she so often was. The first winter in the cabin was hard in ways Walker had not anticipated. He was used to being alone, to silence and routine, and not having to consider another person's needs. Clara had never lived in such rustic conditions, had never faced the brutal cold and isolation of a mountain winter. They argued about small things that became big things. How much wood to use on the fire, whether to salt the meat more or less, how often they should make the difficult journey down to town for supplies. But they also learned each other's rhythms and needs, learned to give each other space when necessary, and to come together when one of them was struggling. Clara discovered she loved the peace of the mountains, the way the snow fell in perfect silence, and the world felt clean and new each morning. Walker discovered he loved having someone to talk to, someone to share the small moments with, someone who made the cabin feel like a home instead of just a shelter. Clara taught him to read better, to write more than just his name, opening up worlds through books she had brought from Boston. Walker taught her to shoot, to trap, to read the weather and the animal signs that meant the difference between safety and danger. They cooked together, worked together, made love in front of the fire while snow piled up outside. When Walker woke screaming from nightmares, Clara was there to hold him and remind him he was safe, that the war was over, that he was home. When Clara cried from homesickness or frustration with their hard life, Walker held her and promised that spring would come, that it would get easier, that she was stronger than she knew. Spring did come, melting the snow and revealing the meadows full of wildflowers Clara had only imagined. Walker took her to his favorite places: a waterfall that thundered down granite cliffs, a hidden valley where elk came to graze, a peak where they could see for 100 miles in every direction. Clara sketched and wrote in journals, documenting everything she saw, and Walker realized she had been serious about writing articles for Eastern publications. In the summer, they made their first attempt at guiding, taking a professor from Salt Lake City and his 2 adult sons into the mountains for a month-long expedition. It was challenging and occasionally frustrating, but it worked. The professor paid them well and promised to recommend their services to others interested in seeing the wilderness. Clara continued to teach in Boise during the school year, riding down with Walker each autumn and returning to the cabin each summer. It was not the life she had been raised for, but it was the life she had chosen, and she never once expressed regret. 2 years after their wedding, Clara gave birth to their first child, a son they named Thomas after her father. The birth happened in the cabin with only Walker and a midwife from town to help, and Walker had never been so terrified in his life, not even in the war. But Clara was strong, and their son came into the world howling his displeasure at the cold mountain air. Walker held his son for the first time and felt something fundamental shift inside him. This tiny person depended on him completely, trusted him to provide and protect and be better than he had ever been. "I will not fail you," he whispered to the baby. "I will be the father you deserve." Thomas grew up running wild in the mountains, as comfortable climbing rocks as walking on flat ground. When he was 3, Clara became pregnant again, and this time they had a daughter they named Alina after Clara's mother. 2 years after that came another son, William, and their cabin had to be expanded to accommodate the growing family. The guiding business flourished as word spread about the mountain man and his educated wife, who could show people the wilderness safely, while also providing fascinating information about the geology, plants, and animals they encountered. Clara wrote articles that were published in magazines back east, and Walker's name became known among those who wanted authentic frontier experiences. Reverend Thomas lived long enough to see all 3 of his grandchildren born, and he passed peacefully in his sleep when Walker and Clara had been married 8 years. They buried him beside the church he had built, and Clara cried for weeks, but she also told Walker that her father had died happy, knowing she was loved and safe and living the life she had chosen. As the children grew, Walker taught them everything he knew about surviving and thriving in the mountains. Young Thomas became an expert tracker by the time he was 10. Alina could identify every plant and animal they encountered and had her mother's gift for writing about what she saw. William had his father's quiet strength and his mother's stubborn determination. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Walker and Clara took a rare trip alone, leaving the children with a trusted friend in Boise and riding up into the high country to the spot where Walker had proposed. They sat by a fire much like the one that had burned that night, older now but no less in love. "Do you ever regret it?" Walker asked, voicing a fear that still occasionally surfaced. "Giving up the life you could have had for this one?" Clara looked at him like he had grown a second head. "Walker Quinn, I have never regretted a single day with you. This life is hard sometimes, yes, but it is also beautiful and full and real. I have 3 healthy children, a husband I love more than anything, work that matters, and these mountains that never stop taking my breath away. What more could I possibly want?" "I just want you to be happy," Walker said. "I am happy," Clara replied firmly. "Are you?" Walker thought about the question seriously. The nightmares had faded over the years, becoming rare visitors instead of nightly torments. He still had days when the darkness crept in, when he felt the weight of old sins and losses, but they were fewer and farther between. The cabin he had built as a refuge had become a true home, filled with love and laughter and the beautiful chaos of children. The mountains he had hidden in were now a place he shared with others, teaching them to appreciate the wilderness instead of fearing or destroying it. "Yes," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "I am happy. You made my rough life better, Clara. You made everything better." She smiled and kissed him, and they lay under the stars together just as they had that first night, but now they were not 2 broken people searching for meaning. They were partners, parents, survivors who had built something good and lasting from the wreckage of their pasts. Years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges, but also joy. Young Thomas eventually left to attend university back east, where he studied natural sciences and later became a professor himself, but he always returned to the mountains he loved. Alina married a doctor in Boise and raised her own family there, close enough that Walker and Clara could see their grandchildren regularly. William stayed with his parents, taking over more and more of the guiding business as Walker's knees began to protest the long mountain treks. On Walker's 65th birthday, he and Clara sat on the porch of the expanded cabin, watching the sun set behind the peaks. Their hair was gray now, their bodies marked by decades of hard work and hard living, but they still held hands like newlyweds. "Do you remember what Pete Henderson said that first day?" Walker asked. "That you were too holy for someone like me," Clara laughed, the sound still as bright as it had been 40 years earlier. "I remember. He was wrong, of course. Was he?" Walker looked at his wife, seeing both the young woman who had stepped off a stage coach in a blue dress and the strong, weathered woman she had become. "You were the preacher's daughter. You could have had an easy life with someone respectable. Walker, we have been married for 42 years. When are you going to believe that I chose exactly what I wanted?" But her tone was gentle, understanding that old fears sometimes resurfaced even after decades of proof. "I was not too holy for you. If anything, you were too good for me, though you would never believe it. You are the most honorable man I have ever known." Walker shook his head, but he was smiling. "You always did see me better than I saw myself." "That is what love does," Clara said simply. "It helps us see the truth about ourselves and each other." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged, the same stars they had watched together for more than 4 decades. Walker thought about the man he had been when he first came to these mountains, broken and angry, and convinced he deserved nothing but solitude and suffering. He thought about the woman who had refused to accept that narrative, who had seen something worth saving in him and had loved him into believing it himself. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For making my rough life better. For being stubborn enough not to give up on me. For giving me a reason to become more than I was." Clara squeezed his hand. "You did the same for me, you know. I was drowning in expectations and propriety back east, suffocating under the weight of being the perfect preacher's daughter. You showed me what it meant to be truly free, to build a life based on what mattered rather than what was expected. We saved each other, Walker. That is what love is supposed to do." As the night deepened and the temperature dropped, they went inside to the warmth of the cabin. The fire was already burning, laid by William before he had left for his own small cabin nearby. The walls were decorated with Aliner's sketches and photographs of grandchildren, with books lining shelves Walker had built decades ago. This was home, Walker thought as he helped Clara into her favorite chair by the fire. Not just the physical structure, but everything it represented. A life built together through hardship and joy, through mistakes and forgiveness, through choosing each other every single day even when it was difficult. He settled into his own chair beside her, and they sat as they did most evenings, reading or talking or simply being together. Outside, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging, the wilderness that had witnessed their love story and sheltered their family for so many years. Walker Quinn had lived a rough life. There was no denying that. But Clara Lawrence had made it immeasurably better, had transformed survival into living, solitude into belonging, and a broken man into a husband and father who could finally believe he deserved the happiness he had found. And when they finally went to bed that night, climbing the stairs that creaked in familiar patterns, Walker held his wife close and thanked whatever force had brought them together all those years ago in a dusty Idaho town. She had been the preacher's daughter, supposedly too holy for a rough mountain man. But she had become his salvation, his partner, his love, and together they had created something more beautiful than either could have imagined alone. The story of their love became legend in Boise, passed down through generations of children who learned in the schoolhouse Clara had helped establish. People spoke of the mountain man who had been tamed by love, and the proper Boston lady who had found freedom in the wilderness. But those who knew them best understood the truth was more complicated and more beautiful than any simple legend could capture. They had not been tamed or transformed into something they were not. Instead, They had each found in the other permission to become more fully themselves, to embrace both strength and vulnerability, both wildness and civilization, both independence and deep connection. They had built a life that honored both the mountains and the town, both solitude and community, both tradition and adventure. And when Walker finally passed away at the age of 78, with Clara holding his hand and their children and grandchildren gathered around, his last words were simple and true. "You made everything better, Clara. Everything." Clara lived another 5 years after that, long enough to see great-grandchildren born and to know that the legacy she and Walker had built would continue. She spent those years writing their story, documenting not just the facts but the feelings, the struggles and triumphs, the small daily choices that had added up to a lifetime of love. When she joined Walker in the small cemetery beside the church her father had built, the whole town turned out to say goodbye to the woman who had taught so many of their children and grandchildren, who had shown them that strength came in many forms, and that love could bridge any gap if people were brave enough to reach across it. Their graves were side by side, simple markers that read Walker Quinn, beloved husband and father, and Clara Quinn, beloved wife and mother. But those who visited often left wildflowers from the mountains, honoring the love story that had begun with a mountain man and a preacher's daughter, and had grown into something that changed an entire community. The cabin in the mountains still stood, maintained by their descendants as a reminder of where it all began. Young couples sometimes hiked up to see it, to stand in the place where two people had chosen love over fear, connection over isolation, and had proved that sometimes the most unlikely pairings create the strongest bonds. And on clear nights when the stars shone bright over the Sawtooth Mountains, locals swore you could sometimes hear laughter echoing from the high country, the sound of two souls who had found each other against all odds and had created something beautiful and lasting from the rough materials of their imperfect lives. The end.